Hey there, everyone. It's a privilege to be back with you. George Soros admits that nationalism is now the dominant ideology throughout the world. That's what we'll be talking about on today's video. One of the most fascinating features or characteristics of the advocates, the proponents of globalism, is their sense of its inevitability. When you read, for example, the British sociologist and globalist theorist Anthony Giddens, he sees globalism as a world that has a life of its own. It's beyond anyone's ability to control. And these scholars would cite the Soviet Union as an example, as over and against, say, modern China, in terms of how both handled globalism differently. The Soviet Union stood in the way of globalism, basically said, you shall not pass. We will not have your consumerist economy or your standardized political protocols. We won't have your advertising, your glitz and your glam. We won't have your singular telecommunications structures. And as a result, they got mowed over. You simply can't stop globalism and its reconfiguration of politics, economy, and culture around transnational, corporate-based technocracy. You just can't fight it. And so, of course, China sees this and says, I think we have room for a stock market and corporate enterprise. Yeah, I think we'll call it managed capitalism and see how that works. This is the supposed inevitability of a one-size-fits-all globalized world. You either learn to accommodate it or it gets rid of you one way or the other. This is why Francis Fukuyama could call the age of globalism, in effect, the end of history. There's no conceivable political or economic system that's able to surpass or transcend globalism. Well, now, as it turns out, this secular eschatology, this modernist conception of progress and inevitability, is beginning to sound increasingly absurd. More and more secular leftist globalists are coming to terms with the fact that the supposed inevitability of a mass worldwide liberal globalist society, well, let's just say it's not so inevitable after all. Even Obama, when he left office, gave signals that even he was having his doubts on the inevitability of globalism. If you recall, he originally, at the beginning of his presidency, caricatured people living in rural areas of, say, Pennsatucky. He accused them of clinging to their religion and their guns as futile attempts to resist this remaking, what we call the fundamental remaking of the United States. And what he meant by this, of course, was that the United States was going to be the leader in a world now increasingly recalibrated around the goals of globalism. So the United States was going to be the leader in championing liberal democracy, identity politics, human rights, environmental protections and protocols, transgenderism, free markets, the sovereign individual. The United States will be the champion of a de facto one world government, replete with institutions such as the EU and the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and the like. And any culture or tradition or custom that stands in the way of this new world order will be caricatured as hateful, bigoted, ignorant, nativist, and the like. It'll be effectively ostracized by the so-called international community. Well, when Obama left office, he recognized that his dream of a world united in secular liberalism was actually turning into a nationalist nightmare. In his final speech to the United Nations, he said that we as a world have a choice, and I'm going to quote him here. We can choose to press forward with a better model of cooperation and integration, or we can retreat into a world sharply divided and ultimately in conflict along age-old lines of nation and tribe and race and religion. So you'll notice here that globalism has no tolerance whatsoever for societies governed by traditionalist religious sentiments. No tolerance at all. Such societies are retreats. They're threats to a better world of cooperation and integration. And of course, the standardized protocols for such cooperation and integration are the anti-cultural and anti-democratic institutions of secular globalism. But note that Obama, at the end of his presidency, recognized that these traditional religious sentiments may be, in fact, having the last laugh. Maybe it is turning out that globalism is not so inevitable after all. Well, now it's not just Obama who's having his doubts. Another prince of the new world of secular corporatist globalism is also recognizing that globalism and globalist sentiments are collapsing all over the place, and that nationalism is becoming the dominant ideology throughout the world. And that person is none other than the infamous George Soros, the billionaire financier of dozens of channels of the Open Society foundations that promote a radical vision of secular liberal globalization throughout the world, but most particularly in Europe. Now, in a recent interview with the Financial Times, Soros admitted that globalism and globalist sentiments are collapsing everywhere we look. And in its place, a new world order based on nation, culture, religion, and tradition is rising. He had reluctantly admitted that the European Union is actually on the verge of breaking down, particularly through the efforts of our champion nations like Hungary and Poland, were the two greatest challenges to Brussels' devotion to secularization and globalization, the great defenders of Christian civilization. And he pointed out that he was himself the object of such a challenge, particularly from the likes of Hungary. Soros is basically being treated by the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban as the head of an extensive mafia network of NGOs and human trafficking. And this is all part of Orban's consistent stand against Merkel and the efforts by Brussels to impose mass immigration quotas on the various nations of Europe that Soros, of course, is promoting vigorously. And then Soros went on to admit that Vladimir Putin is exercising extraordinary influence in marginalizing and frustrating his open society efforts. Soros and his network have been banned from Russia. He's considered, rightly in my opinion, to be a threat to both the national and what Russia calls its spiritual security of the nation. And of course, Soros laments this and sees it as a step back. He's as old. He is, as all the corporatist media outlets like to remind us, a Jewish Holocaust survivor who's already suffered from this horrible nationalism. And he's so sad to see it all coming back, to see the world, in Obama's term, retreat back and has tribalized these religious loyalties rather than progress into a world of cooperation and integration. Did I mention that he is a Holocaust survivor? Because that's what you're going to get in the media. Now, the most telling thing from the interview, ignoring for the time of how should I say it, how sympathetic the Financial Times is to Soros. I mean, they are incredibly pandering to Soros. I want to stop and make that clear. It's pretty pathetic. Maybe they're thinking they're going to get some of his cash. But I think the most telling thing from this interview is simply this. When one of the secular aristocracy of this new globalist world order admits that they're losing, that the world is turning away from their globalist vision and collapsing into nationalist loyalties, when the elite, the secular elite, begin to admit this, it's over, okay? I mean, it's Soros, who's basically operating from the air traffic control tower, looking down on all his minions, his NGOs, he's pouring billions into, says, yeah, it's not working. I'm trying to make the world more secular and globalist, and it's actually becoming more and more traditionalist and nationalist. I mean, when you have these princes of globalism talking like this, you know the jig is up. When the ones who are financing secular globalist propaganda are admitting that no one's buying the propaganda, it's over. In other words, we're not far away from the propagandist outlets like CNN and MSNBC and the Washington Compost and the New York Slimes more and more admitting, yeah, this is over. This whole dream of a new world order predicated on gay marriage and transgenderism and liberal markets and human rights, a world that effectively marginalizes nationalism, historic religion, and traditions. That world ain't happening. You can only get frustrated so many times with something before you move on. Now, of course, we're not quite there yet with Soros or the media. He pledged to work harder than ever to make the world in his own secular, liberal image. But what's he going to do with his tens of billions of dollars that hasn't already failed him? What's he going to tweak to make these anti-cultural, anti-traditionalist processes more desirable? I don't see it. And the fundamental reason why I don't see it, my ace in the hole, as it were, is in what Soros doesn't seem to recognize, is that the very philosophical foundation of globalism has died in the hearts and minds of most Westerners. We simply don't believe anymore in a one-size-fits-all political and economic and cultural meaning system for all people, nations, and cultures. We just don't believe that anymore. We don't believe that the Middle East is ripe for democracy. We don't believe in an Arab Spring. We don't believe in the inevitability of progress and that science and technology are the only standards, objective standards of knowledge that will eventually solve any and all problems. We just don't believe in the universality of human rights. There was a time when Western populations were willing to give that belief a chance, especially during the height of the Cold War. Western Europe and the United States were certainly standing together arm in arm around liberal democracy, as say over and against the totalitarianism of Soviet communism. But now that communism is dead, we're just not buying this notion that now history has come to an end and that the world is ready for a new world order comprised of a one-size-fits-all political and economic system run through a de facto one-world government. We don't buy it. And if we don't buy that basic assumption, then the future prospects of globalism are dead. Its one-size-fits-all vision of life crashes and burns. And I think we're seeing more and more secular and globalist elites coming to terms with this, that the prospects for a globalist world order really are coming to an end. As always, please give us a big thumbs up, that good old like that you smack down on there. I'd love to read your comments. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and help us to get to the big 10,000 subs milestone. God bless.